Soil is a filter, healthy soil. Biological organisms and chemical interactions with those organisms in the soil, in these pore spaces, in the sponge, actually clean water. If you had to live in these landscapes, would you choose the flour or the bread if you were a farmer? If you were growing plants of any kind, you would likely choose the bread. The bread is wet all the way through. We have full saturation. If these landscapes were out in hot, hot, sunny conditions for days after this rainstorm, this one would evaporate and get covered with a hard, crusty surface, would not take in water the next time it rained. This one would get a little stale on the outside, so to speak, because it's bread, and down in the middle you would still have some moisture, so organisms and plants in this landscape would still be able to get a drink. If you had to build a house in one of these landscapes, you would likely choose the bread. Your house here might be in the waterway. If you had to get water from natural sources in one of these landscapes, you would likely choose the bread because you might be able to find it after it rained and you would want to drink it, as opposed to this right after a rainstorm. Hi everybody, we're now live, and thank you so much for sitting through our opening. We feel like it's a really important piece of the context for all of our events, and welcome to our last event in the series, Climate and Community Resilience Lesson from the Soil. We're so excited to be here with you on this really beautiful day with a bunch of farmers who, you know, most likely would rather be outside right now. So thanks a lot, everybody, for being here. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to our 4 panelists for today. We have with us Chuck Wooster from Sunrise Farm. Chuck and his wife purchased Sunrise Farm back in 1999. In addition to farming, Chuck has maintained a variety of other interests, including freelancer for the Valley News in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and advisor to Vital Communities Valley Food and Farm. Thanks so much, Chuck, for being here, and I encourage everyone to check out Sunrise Farm. Link should be in the chat shortly, and also you can check out the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website for deeper bios on all of our panelists. So thanks, Chuck, for being here. We also have with us Marita Canedo. Marita, I hope that you'll correct me on my terrible Spanish, and I'm trying to learn, and I hope that you'll help me to do that. Marita is here working with Migrant Justice. Marita does a lot of amazing work in the world, and she works with Migrant Justice to build the voice, capacity, and power of the farm worker community to engage community partners to organize for economic justice and rights. Thank you, Marita, so much for being here today. And we're going to start Marita's video so you can see. Marita, thanks for being here. Our 3rd panelist is Nico Horster. Nico performs the daily management of Broadacres Farm, Shire Beef in Vershire, Vermont. Nico's been involved in countless initiatives in the Upper Valley over the past decades, including, but not limited to, various nonprofits, organizations, construction companies, and intellectual and community building pursuits. Nico is one of my neighbors, and I'm so glad to have you here, Nico. Thanks. And our 4th panelist for today is Maddie MacLeod. Maddie moved to the Upper Valley in the spring of 2019, where they worked as a farmhand at Cedar Circle Farm. They now work for Permaculture Solutions, LLC, a business centered around permaculture designs, installation, and education. Maddie is also involved in a startup heirloom corn and traditional food project called Moon and Stars Arepas, with Nando, who I see is on our call as well today. So thank you all for being here today. We're so glad. And we would like to now, I gave you each a short introduction, and I just want to let everyone know you can find out more about these folks on the websites put in the chat and also on Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition website. But we'd like to now go to each of our panelists in order to give them a chance to further introduce themselves. So first we're going to go to Chuck Wooster.
Okay, hi Kat. Everybody hear me all right?
Great.
Okay, great. Yes, Kat said I own and run Sunrise Farm, or more technically Sunrise Organic Farm LLC. And we have 2 properties in White River Junction south of the village, down towards Heartland. One spot is where my wife and I have lived since 1999, which is sort of up on a back road. And the second site is a property on Route 5 that we acquired about 5 years ago to expand the farm and to increase the production. Our main business is retail organic vegetables that we sell exclusively through an on-farm CSA pickup. So this year we have 350 families who are members of the farm, and we opened a couple weeks ago. So we've had people come into the farm now twice a week or once a week for 2 weeks to pick up what we've got. We have, we grow on a surprisingly small number of acres. Only about 5 or 6 acres are actually in vegetable cultivation. But we have 8 high tunnels, unheated high tunnels. So most of what we're harvesting right now is coming from those high tunnels for the early days of the CSA. But we will ultimately grow some 60 or 80 varieties of vegetables for the customers. And the season runs from the first week of May through the last week of October. We also try to work with other local farms to sell things that we don't grow. In addition to vegetables, we produce grass-fed lamb, pastured chicken, pastured eggs, maple syrup, and a little bit of honey. But we work with a bunch of other producers, including Nico, actually, who has been supplying us with some of his fantastic grass-fed beef that we can provide to our customers. So we try to be a little bit of a central hub as well for others. Question that I wanted to answer directly is, why am I excited about being part of this panel and the soil series? And it's really because I view soil as being essential to culture in every sense of the word, but both biological and human, and of course agriculture itself. So soil is really at the heart of everything that we do. As a society, I think we have a penchant for forgetting that, and yet soil remains sort of the foundation of everything. So it certainly is at the center of our farming practices and what we're really focused on. I think of us as sort of a old school organic farmers, which is we're really trying to grow the soil. And if we have some stuff to sell on the side to finance that endeavor, then so much the better. But the goal really is to create the best possible soil that we can. So that's a little bit of some of the details of what I'm up to and Sunrise Farm.
Thank you so much, Chuck. And we're really excited to get into the questions. And I hope that all of you listeners will be typing your questions into the chat along the way for these folks as you know them, and also as they're speaking and questions develop. Next, we have Marita. Marita, will you introduce yourself a little more than I did?
Yes, thank you, Kat. I hope you hear me well. My name is Marita Canedo. I'm originally from Bolivia, and I'm part of Migrant Justice team. Migrant Justice is a grassroots organization of dairy farm workers in Vermont. And as Kat said, we build the voice, the capacity and power of the farm worker community, and engaging community partners to organize for economic justice and human rights. So basically, we get together and share our experiences as immigrants and farm workers. And so far, the organization has been leading for 10 years. Farm workers have organized around human rights, starting from the access to mobility. So as you know, there is access to driver's license to everybody in Vermont, regardless of your immigration status. We also have created a policy that puts a wall between the police and immigration enforcement. So police cannot act as immigration enforcement agents. However, we see that this has some flaws, and people are still arrested and still surveilled and persecuted. And now, the main thing that migrant justice is doing, it's working on labor and housing issues. So migrant workers had created a program that is called the Mobility Program that I will talk more in detail later, and basically brings economic justice and creates a new system, because the system has failed the immigrant community. And this system really brings standards, enforcement mechanisms, money to pay for it as a support for farmers and also directly to the workers, in a way that creates that companies that are profiting from the farmers and the soil and the work are really having to pay better and pay more for the products that they are getting. So far with COVID, it's been interesting because right now we're called essential workers. And so we're focusing really into that this crisis has been always for us. And it's really exciting for me to be part of this series right now, because a lot of people are not here, starting from the language access. And I'm honored to be the voice for my community and really bring and share with you the exciting things that people are doing and how we can connect like human rights and immigrant rights with climate justice and all these things that we're learning on this series. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marita. I'm really glad you're here. It's great to see your face. Our third guest is Nico Horster. Nico, do you want to give a go?
Sure. Hi everyone. Yeah, the weather is a challenge, but we got some gardening done this morning. So what we focus on Shire Beef, we steward about overall about 300 acres of pasture land. But half of it is ours. We own it, or we steward it in our ownership, and the other ones are lease parcels in our neighborhood, about 20 minutes drive away from us. And we focus on using cattle as a tool to rebuild soil fertility through enhancing the soil biology. We also use compost tea spraying, direct manure application. We have a barnyard with wood chips, so we increase the fungal components of the manure that we bring out after seasoning it, or in terms of the wood chips that we haul out of the barnyard directly onto the fields. I'm also trained in permaculture design, and so we've incorporated a bunch of permaculture design features into our landscape to enhance certain features like calm down drying effects of wind by planting trees in our pastures, to the chagrin of our neighbors. Why would you ruin a perfectly good hayfield? And creating savanna landscape in our pastures to create food and shelter for animals and wildlife in our biosystem. We've participated in a bunch of different experimental trials or features. One was the bubbling project. We set aside a field to not be grazed, and have since come up with a sort of a hybrid design, which we're working on getting funding for an implementation where we can use controlled access grazing to have the bubbling population at the same time as getting some utilization of the grass when it is in its most nutritious state. The most recent project we're working on is in conjunction with UVM and Dartmouth Soil Labs. Is a deep carbon sequestration program experiment by seeding some of our fields with intermediate wheatgrass, also known as Kernza, a project that the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, West Jackson has been improving intermediate wheatgrass over the last 20 years to become a perennial wheat which would be good for grain harvest and without having to be annually planted. Wheatgrass also has much deeper roots than the indigenous grasses in this area. And we're hoping to see better soils carbon stabilization rates than we currently are seeing in a climate where we have relatively high rainfall rates, which tend to limit the availability of liquid carbon getting transformed into more stable glomalin or stable forms of carbon. And that is a 3-year project that's starting this summer. We have 60. Yeah, I think that's probably enough for now.
I'm really excited to get into the Q&A coming right up next. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here, Nico, especially on, gosh, this incredible day.
Yes.
And now we have Maddie Whaley. Maddie, would you like to introduce yourself a little further?
Hi, my name's Maddie. I like they and she pronouns, for those of you who don't know me. And as Kat expressed earlier, moved here to the Upper Valley last spring, and I was working on Cedar Circle Farm. I was really focused on transitioning the farm to regenerative agriculture. So have a little bit of experience working on a farm that's trying to incorporate soil health principles, and still learning a lot. I'm learning more now working with Karen Gainey, who some of you may know in the community, at Permaculture Solutions, which is focused on permaculture installations, design, and education around the area, as well as working with Nando Hamarillo, who, yes, is on the call and has a great startup project called Moonstar's Arepas, which is really focused on producing traditional foods, primarily flint corn of the native Abenaki varieties, and growing in regenerative Three Sisters techniques to provide food that is healthy and culturally specific and culturally relevant to folks in this area, especially Colombian folks. And we're actually going to be planting a little bit with Nico tomorrow, which is very exciting. So shout out, thanks Nico. Yeah, and so I'm still pretty young and new to farming. I grew up in a very suburban area, and so have a lot to learn, and I'm glad to have been in conversation with so many of the people on this call, and I'm very excited about all of the work that Kat and Lauren have been doing in the soil series to kind of like help make soil health principles something that's more accessible to individuals such as myself who are really interested but maybe didn't have traditional education in food growing or soil sciences. And I'm especially excited to be on this panel with people from pretty diverse farming backgrounds. I think that it'll be great to hear, you know, each person's different perspective that I think all lean in somewhat cohesive directions. So glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Maddie. And so now you've all heard from our 4 panelists, and we're going to start our questions. We have a few started, but we would love for our listeners to go ahead and type your questions into the chat. And remember that if you have something specific for one of the panelists, just make sure to to write their name specifically. And if it's for everybody, you can say that as well. That will help us to ask the right questions. So our first question, and this is going to go to Chuck first, and we'll go in the same order as we go. So it'll go Chuck, and then Marita, and then Nico, and then Maddie. So Chuck, the first question for you is, what changes do you think need to be made in Vermont and beyond to shift towards a regenerative culture and economy for all? It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kat, and I've, in my mind, sort of tried to break it down into sort of 2 pieces. One of which I think is sort of a production, like a farming issue, and something that I think that we really need to return our focus to is the importance of organic matter and building soil, in particular through the use of ruminants and other animals. I think there has been, as we, I shouldn't say come to grips with climate change, but as people talk about climate change, there's been an interesting, I think, diversion of people who are focusing on what they believe to be the negative aspects of meat production. And I think it's important as producers for us to be clear that while it's a single word called meat, it actually encompasses a very wide range of production techniques, animal welfare, ecological impacts, and that, especially in a place like Vermont, I feel like fundamentally our landscape, because it's so rolling, that we really are an animal landscape, which is to say primarily our food production that we can accomplish here in the Green Mountains, if we were to be reducing our fossil fuel use, is going to need to revolve around animals in a really important way, both because animals can graze on land and regenerate the soil on land that is too steep for annual cultivation of vegetables. So, and that's most of our land. So even if we cultivate all of the vegetable land that we can, and I would love to see us do that, there's still a tremendous amount of land that is never going to be suitable, especially in a climate regime with more frequent intense rainfall. It's never going to be suitable for vegetable production. And it also gets back to that fundamental realization of soil management, which is that animals and vegetables go together in food production. Since the fossil fuel age, we have split them off, and we make artificial fertilizer to fertilize our vegetables, and then we try to somehow dispose of animal manure in some way that's not toxic and dangerous. I think it may have been Wendell Berry whose observation was, when you take animals off the land, you turn fertilizer into pollution. And I think that's a fundamental realization that here in the Green Mountains, we can be grazing animals and managing animals and using their manure to then grow vegetables in a sustainable way. So really we need to refocus, I think, on that fundamental link of how we produce food and how we can do so in a way that is in keeping with our ecology and geography here. So that's one of the two things that I feel quite strongly about and have been focusing on. And then the second one is actually not an agricultural question at all. It's really a question of the economy and the rules that we have established for our economy and what that means in terms of how much farm workers are paid, how much they're valued, how much food costs, what are the implications of the price that people are willing to pay for food. So the way I try to say this in the most value neutral way that I can is that the problem we face is that there are not a sufficient number of people who are willing to pay the price that local producers believe they need to charge. So that's sort of the gap. We have the situation where kind of the average person on the street, if you ask them about local food, if they know much about it or eat much about it, one of the things that they're going to say about it, one of the adjectives they're going to use is that it's expensive, because they can typically find less expensive calories in terms of the dollars in their wallet by not eating local food. Meanwhile, if you look at the people who are actually working in agriculture in Vermont, by and large, people are very low, are very poorly compensated, often from the farm owners right down to everybody who's working in the fields, working with the animals. So we really have this fundamental problem on both sides of the ledger, which is that people can't afford the food that we grow, and we can't afford to grow the food either. And that's really an economic question. It's a question of how we have our societal values and the things that we and where we place value in this society. But until we can figure that out, then it's a real setback. I think it's a real roadblock. I think the real obstacle towards more local food, more caring for our soils, is that we need more people eating the food from here. And so in order to do that, we have to figure out the economics of how to make that possible. It's not really a production problem, it's an economic problem.
Thank you, Chuck. Really great thoughts there. We're going to go to Marita. And again, the question, Marita, is, sorry, what changes do you think need to be made in Vermont and beyond to shift towards a regenerative culture and economy for all?
Can I start by saying revolution? Well, the thing is like how I see it, and I think Chuck, you touched on a very important point. I'm going to be the voice telling everybody, don't forget the human factor. We cannot keep trying to change the soil and the prices and the climate and how our animals are treated and how we treat our food without thinking the people that are there. And just you said about farm workers not being paid well, and that's a reality, and that's, I think, something that our members had analyzed for years. How can we change that economy? Just follow the money and what it is. But it's not only about redistribution of money. It's really bringing justice, because we see big corporations that have the resources, and not only in money, but in people that can bring programs, that can create things just to brand themselves. However, they are not connecting the dots in the whole supply chain, right? From the soil, from the people putting the seeds, from the people harvesting the food, from the people feeding the animals, to how it goes to process plants and then pack it in supermarkets or stores. Or I think we have the tendency to think that Vermont, it's a very romantic place where we have small farms, very local, beautiful organic things that we have, but it's not the majority. Even that Vermont is not the biggest dairy state in the country, there is the biggest industry for the state. And that's an industry that's really conflicted with climate. It's a dirty industry. And as far as farmers don't understand how can they change that, because they are surviving day by day, because the price of their product is controlled by the corporations, then it's very difficult to bring change. So I think we can fight on the legislation as we're doing, to bring new laws and change things and ask the government to do things. But at the end of the day, we have to take the power and we have to bring these solutions and have the analysis and have this education about what is the system that is really oppressing us and how we have the responsibility to change it, addressing the people that are not taken into account. So I just want to share that, our community, with all the limitations that we have with language, with mobility, with food and all this, people are working in the dairy farms and then going to the supermarket to buy the same milk that they might produce, but it's still not protected with anything. I just want to say, with all those limitations, we are doing an analysis, an economic analysis, a climate analysis of how things can change. And it's always like empowering ourselves and taking back this power and making responsible the people that supposedly should be taking care of our communities, and they are not. So that's what we want to share for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Marita. Really, really great provocative thoughts there. Very important. And next we're going to go to Nico. And that question again, just fresh for you, is what changes do you think need to be made in Vermont and beyond to shift towards a regenerative culture and economy for all?
Well, I mean, I think Chuck and Marita have both touched on very important parts there already. I think the tricky part is how do we change a system while we're so embedded in a system? And I'm talking about capitalism here. As long as we as agricultural pursuants, operate within the limits of capitalism, there's really no chance for regenerative agriculture to happen, period. Why? Because capitalism does not value any resources until they become an economic commodity. So soil, water, trees, plants, they have zero value in our economy based on capitalism until they're exploited and turned into something that can be consumed. And so the value in regenerative agriculture is stabilizing a system to its natural state of equilibrium through biology and management practices. And we can't do that in a system that rewards us only when we exploit the system. And so we're competing against a whole host of other players in this market. And this is a global issue at this point because our economy has become global, that don't play by the same rules. So even if we in Vermont decided to have a regenerative agriculture, it makes a diddly squat of a difference. And I mean, it makes a difference, sure, because we have our local systems more stabilized. We don't have flooding. We don't have, you know, the negative effects of even, you know, minor issues like, you know, taking too much hay off or injecting too much manure, which in comparison to the large exploitative agriculture that we see in other landscapes like the Central Valley in California or the Midwest corn production and so forth, are relatively small. And what has been surprising in this shift of our business, which used to be about 90% wholesale before this pandemic happened, is that there is a tremendous support from local consumers for agriculture. And I think Chuck echoed that as well. And Cedar Circle, for sure, I know is seeing the same increase in other CSAs. And it's not just people who used to be our customers. It's really pretty much across the board. So I'm challenging Chuck a little bit sort of on the economic picture that he painted here, that it is there's an economic question here. And I think it is in part an efficiency and scale question. So when we see local producers saying they need to get a certain amount of price, it's also that we live in communities that are relatively not dense, and that we have therefore much harder access to consumers. Our cost bases are high and our production areas are small, and so it's not just economic challenges. This is environmental challenges or scale challenges based on our landscapes around us. And the economic challenges, of course, come again from capitalism. That's, you know, minimum wage. There's a lot of poverty in Vermont. You know, the jobs aren't paid well overall. There's and the sort of general situation that in the US we are accustomed to spending about half of what's other industrialized nations spend on food on average in percentage of our income, and worldwide we're as percentage of our income one of the nations that spends the least on food. So part of it is also prioritizing our goals. What do you want in life? And that's you know, partially an education thing, and our society has you know, is based on all out consumerism. So Walmart becomes before your local steak, comes before your local steak, and for a lot of people, and you know, the wanting to get gadget X and so forth. It's interesting that there seems to be a little bit of a shift here where people are you know, saying, oh, I really appreciate to have the time to cook and do this, and you know, appreciate, you know, the food, and you know, it's great. I am very leery that this will continue once this pandemic plays itself out and things go back to normal.
Right, the normal.
Yeah.
I have my hopes about what normal will be.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Nico and Maddie. We'd love to hear from you. And I'll repeat that question again for you as well. What changes do you think need to be made in Vermont and beyond to shift towards a regenerative culture and economy for all?
Yeah, thanks, Kat. I mean, really, to echo the three panelists before me said, I really do think, at least nationally, I think really vast economic and systematic change is an absolute necessity in order to get to a true regenerative culture and economy. You know, I personally can't say that I am engaged in policy making on a national level. And so in light of that, I guess I'll focus in a little bit more on what I think is happening and can happen regionally that is starting to address aspects of building a regenerative culture. I think that, like Marita said, like, it's really important to start with the human aspect. And when we're talking about creating a regenerative economy or looking toward building regenerative agriculture, we need to be asking who we're serving and who might be left out of the picture, who's traditionally been left out of the pictures in terms of access to food, access to you know, healthy living wages, etc. One thing that I've been seeing increasingly internationally, but that I think is coming into the Northeast consciousness a little bit more too, is land reparations, or components of that wherein farms or landscaping businesses might take a portion of their proceeds and give that to the tribe on whose land that farm or landscaping business operates, as a way of trying to, you know, kind of like rebuild that social soil, and not only pay respects to, but actively, you know, aim to further the stewardship and the work, and help provide some kind of funds for Indigenous folks to be able to like continue their work and their traditions, even in spite of all of the trauma and sacrifices that they've been making and continue to make on this land for so long. So reparations work, I think, is a really essential place to start. I also think that in terms of increased access, something that growers can do is working to grow more culturally specific foods, as well as provide solidarity shares or donate crops to places like our local Willing Hands. Additionally, I think about this component a lot in terms of creating a regenerative culture in Vermont. Nico was talking about how for farmers, we have a disconnect because of, or not a disconnect, but like a difficult market to navigate, because we have a pretty small pool of potential clients and a pretty large environment to disperse food over. I think that becomes difficult, not just for farmers getting their food to people, but for people getting food from farmers. And I think it makes it difficult for people who want to learn how to grow their own food to maybe be able to like tap into networks that can teach them how to do that, because everything is so spread out in Vermont. So I think that in perhaps a post-COVID time, kind of creating, you know, community hubs that, you know, we do have, you know, like each town has its own church that maybe has occasional workshops, but I think that a more invested effort toward community hub building, which I think is happening through some of Kat and Lauren's work, and the work of others of you on this call, I think that that is going to be really essential toward building a regenerative culture, at least in the community, where, you know, we can get trade networks going and a little bit of self-sufficiency and resiliency moving, you know, despite whatever may play out nationally, in terms of being able to build an economy that gives people decent wages, affordable housing, and free healthcare. Yeah, so those are some thoughts there.
Thank you, Maddie. Those are some really great thoughts. And I just want to put a plug in for One project I'm aware of that's happening in South Royalton, there's a community resilience hub in the making with Vermont Community Resilience Organizations of Vermont and Bale building a local economy. So stay tuned for some good news about that. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren now to ask the second question.
Thank you, Kat. Yeah, so that first round of questions I think was really eye-opening and gave a good in-depth look at like what we think the future can look like. And so thank you all so much. Moving on now to a little bit of a different round of questions. We're going to ask each panelist some specific questions based on their background and their awarenesses. And so I'm going to pull Chuck onto the screen. And Chuck, the question for you, the first question for you, how has your farm been impacted by the climate and COVID-19 crises? Additionally, can you share about your views on regenerative agriculture in Vermont and how meat and animal products are essential to that, beyond what you've already shared, of course?
Sure, yeah. In terms of COVID, there are two main impacts for us. The first is that we have basically sold all of our production much faster this year than we would have. We sold out our CSA shares earlier, even though we had increased those by about 15%. We've increased our number of chickens we raised by half this year, and we're on track to sell those out shortly. We have sold all of the pork and beef from our usual neighbor here in Heartland, and are busy trying to help Nico sell more of his. So there's been a great increase in demand. Unfortunately, in agriculture, it isn't necessarily something you can respond to instantly. It takes a while to order seeds, to prepare ground, to either raise or acquire baby animals. And so I share a little bit of, I think, Nico's concern that there's this huge interest right now in local agriculture, and potentially, we try to sort of, meet that demand, and then next year discover that everybody has gone back to Hannaford, especially when half the valley is unemployed, and there's not a spare dollar to be had. So I think there's a real question of how we can match up as best we can with supply and demand. The other side of it is we've actually hired extra staff. And partly that was a couple of my returning staff members, their winter work came to an unexpected end when the COVID lockdown happened. They were working in restaurants, and so we hired them early to try and keep them in funds earlier than they would have otherwise been. And I was pretty sure that we would need extra staff because some of us would be in quarantine or ill, or who's to say. So far that has not happened. So we've had extra staff, which has been great. Because in terms of setting up our farm stand, we have a CSA style where people choose their vegetables every week from amongst the offerings. We were very eager to continue that and to not, go to sort of a fixed box for people. And so we've been able to change the setup of our farm stand, which is in an old barn, which is very fortunate because we had a lot of space that we could use to maintain social distancing and other things while people grab their veggies. So the real change for us from COVID so far has been trying to figure out the retail piece of this, of how to get our food to our neighbors in a way that's safe for us and for them. So that's the big part of COVID. In terms of the climate, the main issue we've seen is that the rainfall is more intense. So that further gets us into that idea of, can we really be growing vegetables? And in that I include feed corn in that too. Can we be really growing this, these calories on steep slopes when the rainfall is that much more intense? And I love in the opening here, the look at bread and water being absorbed into the bread, which is fantastic. And then you start tipping that bread on its side, and the equation starts to change too when you just get runoff in that way. So I'll just toss one more idea out there before I move on, which is in response, I think, to a couple of questions from Henry and maybe a comment from Nico. This economic question. One thing I think that is easily lost is that if we could have a real and substantial cost on carbon, that would make an enormous difference to all of these issues that we have talked about. fossil fuel is at the center of industrial agriculture, is at the center of the degradation of our landscape, is at the center of why food is so cheap. It's at the center of why Vermont is less competitive than other states, competitive in sort of the current marketplace that we exist under. The basic equation I like to keep in mind is that on the one hand, you have economy of scale, which is to say it makes sense for people to get bigger because then you achieve efficiencies and you can lower your production costs. And what has always balanced that has been the cost of transportation. At some point, it doesn't make sense to have one huge farm, 1,000 miles away if it's expensive to move the food back to the people who need it. But we as a country, as a culture, and as a civilization, we subsidize transportation enormously. Partly, you can think of it at the local level. We build our roads and stuff and we pay for them with tax dollars. We don't charge people to use them. We essentially subsidize the local network. We do it all the way up the chain. We subsidize airlines, airports, shipping, railroads, highways, all the way up and down the line. And so if you could, in fact, have that transportation bear a real cost with it, then you would see an incredible, I think, renaissance of regenerative agriculture, because suddenly, not only would the ecology say we should be raising food in this wonderful way, but the market would be saying the same thing. So, how far we go down towards the road to revolution, I'm not sure, but that's the road through. Like, we've got to change the economic model at all levels.
Couldn't agree more, Chuck. And in an ideal world, I guess here's the second question for you too, based on this idea that people do have all this free time right now and are trying to grow their own food at home with whatever rate of success they'll find. I guess how can your community support you now and in the future? And if people do start growing their own food at home, how can they do it in such a way that your farm is still able to succeed, which would be a great challenge.
Yeah. No, I think getting back to what I said a moment ago, the way that the community could really support all of us local growers is by being steady, by being here today and here tomorrow, so that we can also be steady. I think that's incredibly important. And your idea of people growing their own food is great. And occasionally in the CSA barn, one of my members will say to me, sometimes sheepishly, like, "Oh, I planted some of my own tomatoes," And I think that is absolutely fantastic for a number of reasons. One is because people often will plant the thing that they love, that they can't get enough of. So that's fantastic, right? You have your CSA, which gives you sort of this breadth of vegetables, and you have your hand in to grow like a ton of basil and tomatoes or whatever it is that you love. So I think those are very complementary, and people growing their own food, among other things, it gets them in connection to soil. It gets them back into connection to what that whole cycle means. And I think it increases their appreciation for local food in all of its forms, right? I mean, if you're growing your own garden and you're tasting your own lettuce and you taste how sweet it is and how wonderful it is, then you're going to insist on that same lettuce when you're out in the marketplace too. So I really love this idea of people growing, more of their own food. And I think it's completely, it's very synergistic with the local farm movement as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chuck. Really appreciate your time today. If anybody has any additional questions for Chuck, please put those into the chat and we will come to those in our third round of questions. So thank you again, Chuck. And now I'm going to move over to Marita, and we have some questions for you as well. Hey, Marita. So again, kind of building off what you talked about in your introduction and the first round of questions, I think you touched on it quite a bit actually, but would love to hear more about how the current COVID-19 and climate crises are affecting the migrant farm workers that you partner with at Migrant Justice.
Sure. So farm workers are the leaders for Migrant Justice. We won't exist without them. And it's interesting when we ask people, what's going on. The first thing was fear. Fear of getting sick and not having access to healthcare. Fear that being sick and not being able to work. So if you lose your job, you also lose your housing situation because farms provide housing. And the more the time passed, people are still working the same shifts. People are still isolated more now. So the biggest thing that we see that is coming is a long-term consequence of COVID. So far, farms are already closing. Other farms are lowering the hours, and other farms are just reducing personnel. So people are really getting less money, losing their jobs, and adding to having to leave the state to look for jobs in other places, in other states, so traveling around, which brings another issue. You know, when you're in a pandemic and you have to be isolated, people have to start driving. We just heard from some people driving from Vermont to California because it was the only choice that they have to find another job, and they are going to be driving. So that's interesting. So the food insecurity has been bigger in the case of, like I was saying, people didn't feel like they can go to the supermarkets. So we partner with some volunteers around the state to support that effort. Also, more than people getting sick, it's just parents are way busier this time because kids are at home, and because they're not taking time off. It's like they don't have free time now. So they have to be the educators of the kids plus still working. We have heard that the cooperative, the co-ops that buy the milk decided only to pay 85% of the production. And you might have heard that farmers are dumping the milk. And with that, that's why farmers are deciding either to close or to reduce the hours. But other farmers are buying those cows that other farmers are selling. And what we hear is that they are not increasing the payment for the farm workers. It's just they're increasing the time work because now there are more cows on different farms. So it's interesting to see how the co-ops really are deciding and defining their own supply chain between farmers, but without any support to farmers or the farm workers. And I think it's very, very interesting, when we talk about a more local economy, and we know that these farms are selling to big supermarkets or to big companies. How do we attack that, right? How do we tackle this? We make it more local. I think the dairy industry, it's very, very complicated, and we need to understand better, because even though some farms are selling to Hannaford or Ben & Jerry's or Hood, they also selling to Boot Brothers and also selling to your local co-op, in Montpelier or in Burlington. So I think it's more to understand the supply chain, and like I think the biggest impact we're going to see in our communities is long term, when people have already lost their jobs and housing.
Thank you. Yeah, and you did kind of bring up the whole Hannaford connection too. So can you explain a little bit more about the Milk with Dignity campaign and the current work being done to have Hannaford join the campaign? And similarly, can you help us draw the connection between workers' rights and environmental and climate justice in that entire scope, briefly?
Okay, I'll do my best. So, the Hannaford campaign is asking Hannaford supermarkets to join the Milk with Dignity program. Hannaford gets their brand milk from hood plants all over Northeast region. The hood plants get their milk from different co-ops in Vermont, from DFA and Agrimark Cabot. So right now the program is working with Ben & Jerry's. So all the farms that supply Ben & Jerry's are under the program. In the third year now, we see that this is working, and it's really bringing change in the life of farm workers directly, not only economically, but also in their dignity and having their rights respected. So we know that this needs to be expanded. What we're asking Hannaford is that they sit down with us, with farm workers, and implement this program. That would mean that they will have to sign an agreement and define their supply chain, and a kind of making a calculation with mass volume of the milk that they need for their brand milk. And with this, pay a premium to those farms. And this premium has to be used only to comply with the standards that the workers have created. So it's all about housing and labor rights. So we sent a letter to the CEO without any response. We made phone calls and emails, and then we decided to launch a public campaign. After launching the public campaign, a month passed, and we have a day of action in different states in the Northeast region. And after that, we started a tour. So we were visiting different states, teaching people and consumers about the program and the campaign. And with COVID, the impact that we had is that we had to stop. We couldn't keep traveling, and we know that the CEO is no longer at his office, so we cannot reach out to him. However, during all this time, what we've been doing is still doing research in other dairy products in supermarkets and keep connecting the community with the understanding of why is this needed, why is it possible, and how can people support the campaign. So there are different ways to support, and understanding that I think a week ago, the company Ahold, who owns Hannaford, just shared that they have an increment of earnings since March. Why? Because people are running to the supermarkets. And as we hear Chuck, like you have more sales now, and that's amazing. Well, supermarkets are tripling their earnings, and they still not sharing that loot with the farm workers. And that's exactly what the program will bring. Now, how this all connects with climate crisis and climate change and the environmental justice, it's simple, Like we were saying at the beginning, like human beings are in this world a part of the climate, and we're part of the circle. And while people are being abused in their human rights, where people are forced labor in modern slavery, and there is still being this dirty business, these dirty farms that don't care about the environment, nothing is going to happen. When you have the resources to improve the life on the dairies, then you can talk about, okay, let's do more grazing for the cows, let's do change of soils and these kind of things, and that we ask the farmers to do in dairy, but we don't give them any resources. And by doing that, they are abusing and putting more pressure to the workers. So to avoid that, we have to bring that human factor, and that's how it connects, because we cannot deny that there is a migrant population sustaining the industry. So we can talk a lot about beautiful things, but still that community is still here.
Thank you so much, Marita. Really appreciate your thoughts on this and all the work that you and migrant justice teams do in our state and beyond, and the way you're changing the narrative nationally and internationally. So thank you. If anybody has any questions for Marita, please put those into the chat, and we'll ask those again in the third round of questions.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to go to Nico and build on some of what you were talking about earlier, Nico. And a similar question as to what we asked Chuck for your first question. How has your farm been impacted by the climate and COVID-19 crises, and have you transitioned any of your agriculture or economic practices because of those crises?
Yeah, so the impact has been stressful, but really positive in that a lot of people are interested in buying more local food. As I said earlier, we're maybe 85-90% wholesale, mostly Skinny Pancake, Worthy Burger, and a couple local co-ops. And now the wholesale market, most of the wholesale market has completely collapsed. The restaurants for sure, and I don't see them coming back anytime soon at the level that they were at. If they're coming back, it's going to be at a somewhat reduced level. Had a longish conversation yesterday with Kelton Smith over at Sunrise Soul Food and Fairly. They're doing takeout foods. I brought him some beef, but the amount of work that all takeout orders create for a kitchen flow is insane. So nothing I had thought about, but it's interesting to hear. So the throughput is definitely limited by that. They're not a McDonald's. They're not set up that way. So we've switched to on-farm pickups. We have store hours. We also started reaching out to other CSAs. We have CSA share distribution with Route 5 Farm. We have on in-store pickup with Sunrise and Cedar Circle Farm. So we're pretty well represented sort of in our local thing. In terms of the meat, we're actually at a point where we are experiencing supply shortages in our beef supply. We've tried to keep our prices pretty much the same. We mark up our wholesale prices from before COVID by a certain percentage for our retail customers, which puts us price-wise well below co-op prices. And at this point, probably on par with Hannaford's, where the quality of the meat is certainly not the same. Which I think we are seeing a lot of appreciation for, and people willing to come to the farm for that, and you know, puts us again pricing wise in a level where we're not competing with our wholesale resellers directly. So I think that's all working out pretty well. It's been a shift. We had to switch to a new software program, a new ordering system, customer management, order management, logistics, subscribe to a specialized meat order system, you know, just cost of doing business, but definitely a learning curve. A lot more time on the computer than I like. Remind me what the second part.
So the second part of that question was about the transition of your agriculture and economic practices. So I think you touched on that.
Yes. Yeah, in terms of going forward, I think we are, so before this pandemic started, we were thinking of transitioning into a more diversified agriculture and inviting other people to come use our land, like Nando and with his arepa and corn growing initiative and ideas. And we would like to have more of those kind of collaborations or land usages. We were sort of at a point where we have built up soil quality sufficiently to reduce our cow numbers and use them more targeted. Also, the labor of farming other people's land in other locations, but via lease, is not something that we thought was attractive long term. Of course, now all bets are off. But the biggest problem is that our planning and production cycle is 2 years, and so, you know, calf that's born now is ready for slaughter in 2 years, and it's really hard to react quickly and have all of this produced on the farm. So there's definitely going to be changes. What exactly they might be is unclear. I do see that there's an opportunity. There's a big void in winter vegetable production in our area. And I think we're going to start becoming more and more competitive with California as water gets scarcer and more expensive there. And I do hope that we're going to see that. You know, we have the heating cost, they have the water cost that might level the playing field. In you know, and what Chuck alluded to with the carbon pricing, the embedded carbon of food would be fantastic. And unfortunately, what I've seen so far in terms of what carbon is worth is so well below where it needs to be, that it's, you know, of course, oil prices have now collapsed, but let's say pre-COVID, where oil prices were and how much carbon is in oil, if you price that, we were looking at, you know, $400 to $500 a ton in terms of carbon payments. And what's on the table right now is somewhere in the $100 to $150 range, which is, why shouldn't we as farmers get paid the same as the oil industry to put back what they extract? I think that would be a pretty good starting point for a discussion.
Yeah, definitely a great starting point for discussion. I thought the comment you made about the water crisis in California is interesting to think about as Vermonters, and that it's not necessarily our climate changing, but the climate in other places changing, which impacts indirectly our markets. Definitely something I hadn't thought about. So thank you for thinking about that and sharing that with us. And then another question for you: how can your community support you now and in the future? And if people do start growing their own food at home, how can they do it in such a way that your farm is still able to succeed? Again, I know you work mostly with animals, or not mostly, but you work with animals, and so there might be some nuances there that I'm sure we
Yeah,
all.
there certainly are nuances there. It's you know, as I said, it takes 2 years to raise a calf. So you need infrastructure, which, you know, is different than just growing a garden. There's also skills involved, and obviously, and what I've heard, you know, which is interesting from, we've actually won over a few local customers, sort of the diehards that say, well, we always raised our own beef and da 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 da, and they've tasted our beef and they said, well, you do a much better job. So we're going to give that up because it's a lot of work and we don't like the end product all that much. So which is great feedback, and I think that's partially what we're going to see is, you know, the farmers in this area really, you know, this group, Chuck, you know, the ones that the CSAs I mentioned, you know, Sweetland maybe in there too, and, you know, sort of some of the ones that have been longer established, non-organic farms like Crossroads and so forth. They all do a great job. They grow really high quality stuff. Organic or not organic, is you know, there's some debate in philosophy and soil management and all that kind of stuff that we're not going to get into in this discussion. But in terms of the nutrients that they're putting into their stuff, the taste, the freshness, this is all something that really none of the supermarket produce can compare with. Yeah, if you're a really good gardener, you can pull it off at home and have something that is equally fresh and equally good. But it's hard to do. It's a lot of work. And so I hope that a lot of people grow stuff. I hope that they find some success and get inspired, but I also hope that they, and I think that will be the case, that they appreciate how much work goes into it and can see the value in the local food, and not just saying, oh yeah, well, I can buy it at Hannaford, it's cheaper. Never mind that the Kissimmee tomato picker got paid, you know, 1 cent a pound to pick these tomatoes, and now, you know, there was a huge initiative down there. Maybe it's 2 cents a pound, you know, which is how these cheap prices come to pass. And so once people understand what goes into a system, maybe they're more willing and able to understand how to support a system like that we need for local agriculture.
Definitely. Really well said. Thank you so much, Nico.
You're welcome.
Appreciate your time today. If anyone has a question for Nico, I know I see my chat thing blinking, so I'm sure there's lots of questions going in, but keep them coming. Thank you so much. I am going to go now to Maddie and ask Maddie a couple of questions. Hey, Maddie. So I am so excited that you're here because you're a young farmer getting involved in all this stuff too. And so I'm going to ask you about how you got involved with the current projects and the current projects that you're working on, and how you see the profession of farming changing during your lifetime with climate change and global health pandemics. You know, small question.
Yeah. The first part is a pretty straightforward answer. When I moved here and was working at Cedar Circle Farm, I got to know both Karen and Nando. Karen is the Permaculture Solutions project head. Nando is the Moon and Stars project head. I got to meet them both through my work at Cedar Circle Farm and through some like climate justice organizing work in the community here, and just kind of through relationship building when this season was coming closer and they needed more help. I was really excited about both of their projects, and it worked out that I was able to come on to both of them, which has been great. And in terms of how I think farming is going to change in my lifetime, given global health pandemics and climate change, I don't think I can address all of it or even, you know, like know entirely. But I can start with a couple of things. In terms of the pandemic, you know, it's hard, I think, for any of us to know whether this is one of those pandemics that happens every 100 years or so and is going to go away and we're going to kind of forget about it in a couple of years, or whether because of globalization, these things are going to become more and more regular. In any case, I do know that right now, like Chuck and Nico and Marita mentioned, a lot of farmers are actually, especially like local small scale farmers, are seeing increased profits, and a lot of local small scale farmers are seeing increased participation in CSA shares, which is really exciting. And I think similarly to how it's difficult for restaurants to plan takeout orders right now, it is putting a lot more labor on farmers potentially to plan orders for curbside pickup. So there's more, I think us young farmers may have to, learn to like adjust to online platforms, and doing a lot more work around marketing and coordinating food deliveries and harvesting than has happened before, or than I've learned to do while being on the farm, where we kind of harvest, I've been working on vegetable farms, and we just kind of harvest to the quantity that we think we can sell. This can also be a good way of reducing food waste, I think, because now we know how to plan. So I think that, yeah, farming in the pandemic mostly maybe changes just like the logistics of farming itself. And in terms of individuals wanting to start their own gardens, I think that's great and should continue. And with Chuck and Nico's particular farms, they have a lot of animal production, and so that's definitely different. But with vegetable farming anyway, I think that there's a lot of room to move toward saving seeds and starting plants and selling like annual like vegetable crops in more of a nursery style, where people can take starts home and pay a decent retail value for vegetable starts as well as perennials. And I think that ties into the climate change piece, where I think that in my lifetime we're going to have to see a really huge shift toward perennial crops, which are crops that reseed or are like shrubs or trees that sustain themselves for more than 1 year, because most, especially native perennials, tend to be better for ecosystem health, and also might be able to be more resilient and adapt to the changes that we're seeing with the changing climate. So I kind of think we'll see, at least for smaller scale local farmers, like a big shift in the type of food that we're producing, and maybe more of a shift toward the nursery model instead of producing vegetables for immediate consumption. I also think that, I think it's a necessity that we shift away from large-scale industrial farming, but especially in light of what Marita's bringing up with how even at this time when a lot of individuals are moving toward supporting CSAs and gardening for themselves, many farm workers on larger scale farms are still facing really terrible working conditions. I think we can't assume that climate change or pandemics are going to automatically restructure things for us. Like, things aren't going to shake out unless we're supporting campaigns like Milk with Dignity, and starting our own projects to really provide income security for the people who work on our farms. So I think that in my lifetime, I hope that we are going to be moving toward production farming and gardening and other food initiatives that are more sustainable for the individuals who work within them. So yeah, those are the two main things that I hope and think we're all kind of working on trying to make happen, is that in the face of climate change, we're both producing food that is going to be better adapted toward ecosystem resilience, and that we're creating work environments within that are more beneficial to the workers. Yeah.
So thank you, Maddie. And one more question for you. As a young and new farmer in Vermont, what are some of the gaps in access or challenges that you and others who are also learning the ropes are facing? And then are there efforts being pursued to address those?
Yeah. I think that here a lot of the issue still kind of relies around access and capitalism, and maybe a lot of farm workers perhaps not being able to put away enough savings to buy land. A lot of us, like young farm workers, are landless and maybe feel like we would not be able to start our own farm projects, which might be okay and might also be able to change. Vermont actually is pretty well situated to support young farmers. There are a lot of grants available through Vermont Agriculture, which I can link in the chat in the moment, many of which are suited to young farmers, especially from diverse backgrounds. But it is still really daunting for, I think, many of us young farm workers who are working at, you know, close to living wages, but not great wages, to be able to think about putting away savings while paying back student loans, most likely, to be able to then also like gain access to land and start farming our own land while working other jobs. Most of the young farmers I know who do have their own land and are starting their own businesses are also working full-time jobs elsewhere to be able to get by in their first couple of years, which is really difficult. So in terms of just that simple land access, I think that you know, increasing access to grants is really important. I think that projects like Nico expressed that, you know, he's trying to use his land to allow other farmers like to have smaller projects on that land. I think that's a really great model too. And I think that in terms of some of the other challenges maybe in trying to learn more as a young farmer, or trying to figure out where one can go as a professional grower in Vermont. I think that particularly for queer folks and folks of color in the state, access to education, while it might be there, might not always feel accessible, it might not always feel safe, with Vermont and New England generally being pretty white dominant, and the farming community being pretty like there are a lot of women farmers. However, there are also a lot of farming workshops and farmers in that area who exude a lot of, you know, like a particular white male standpoint that can be difficult, not because it's wrong, but difficult for people of different cultures or identities to feel comfortable in. So I think that like culturally specific education is really important and something that is really missing in this state, particularly despite all of the other great programs that we do have. I think that some programs that are doing a really great job, I think that the Resilience Food Hub that's going to be started is awesome. That's very exciting. There's a group here in the Upper Valley of seed savers who is really interested in partnering with young growers and teaching, like creating mentorship programs around saving seeds. Likewise, Cedar Circle Farms and Freeverse Farms provide many workshops for adult learning. Sterling College is also a really great example of a place to get more access to different growing techniques and food production techniques that are sustainable and focused on kind of community resilience and creating regenerative culture. Sterling College is pretty far away from us in the Upper Valley. It's up in the Northeast Kingdom, but they do have workshops that are open to the community, and I think that following their model here in the Upper Valley when we put on workshops could be a great thing. Yeah, and I think like generally, like I said, like I think Vermont has a lot to work on in terms of making this education for young farmers more accessible to systematically marginalized populations. However, there are a lot of opportunities out there, and I think just kind of streamlining access to those and helping young farmers figure out how to tap into those is where we can go. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Maddie. Really appreciate the insight and the awareness that you have. So thank you so much for being here today. I am going to have, Kat is gonna hop back on. Hey, Kat. And Kat has our first question, and I believe that what we're gonna do is we're gonna put all the panelists back on. So I'm gonna turn all your videos back on, panelists, and Kat will ask the first question.
All right, so we've had a number of questions and really good conversation happening in the chat. So I hope those of you who are on will look at that, and we'll make that chat accessible afterwards with the recording, also taking out anything that we think you wouldn't really want to be put in the chat. This question is for all of you, and this originated from Henry Swayze, and he asked, what is the path to improving our soil, climate, water the fastest? And he's interested in both the methodology and triggering social change. And I would like to add to that question in terms of social change, especially in terms of creating the kind of access for all people, and especially marginalized populations in Vermont. So what is the path to improving soil, climate, and water health the fastest for all people while increasing access to all of our neighbors?
And we'll go to Chuck first.
I think I just reiterate one of my earlier comments, which I think the quickest, fastest way is through real carbon pricing. I think that's the fastest way, and the benefits would be enormous. In part, that there would be a lot more, or there would be more money available for the people who are working on farms as well, and that would increase the access piece of it, because it would be potentially be a living that you could earn your living doing it. So that would be a wonderful way to increase access. But yeah, I'm interested in what others think. That was just kind of what I had before. So
yeah,
thanks, Chuck. And Marisa, we're going to go to you next.
No, I agree. I agree with Chuck. It's access to land and access to things. You know, a lot of people that are here in the farms, and even myself as an immigrant, you never think you're going to be able to own or have access to something. You're always just here temporary, even if you're living here for more than 10 years. Because of your immigration status or not, you don't feel like you can have access to many, many things. So yeah, changing that and more education to people, I think that will work.
Thank you, Marita. And Nico, we'll ask you that same question.
Cows, more cows, lots, millions more cows. I mean, this is sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think Chuck mentioned this earlier too. Cattle and other ruminants are the fastest way to rebuild soil biology, and soil biology is what puts carbon back into the soil. So yes, a carbon pricing system, but ultimately, if you want the change in productivity of the soils back to where they were when the white people first started plowing up the soils here, and having the biodiversity of the soil, microbial life restored, that the chemicals and fertilizers we've thrown on them for the last 100 years or so. If we want those back, we need lots more ruminants on this planet. There used to be vast herds of ruminants that were in the Pleistocene that are all gone. So that we know that the the climate is not affected by it. It's the management of the cattle that affects the climate, not the number of the cattle. It's not the cow, it's the how.
I love that phrase. It's not the cow, it's the how. And Maddie, what would you like to say about that same question?
I would like to agree that I think that increased access to land is essential for all people, especially young farmers and immigrant farmers. And I think that adding animal ruminants to soil is essential for rebuilding soil health. I also want to touch on, in terms of rebuilding water health, I think that something that can also help soil and water health both is planting like native plants that are both nitrogen fixing and help with preventing runoff, which is a really big issue for the water health component. So that could be nitrogen fixers like lupin is a native wildflower whose seeds you can also harvest, shrubs like currants or gooseberry, etc., that are edible and hold land in its place.
Thank you, everybody. The next question is kind of a broad one, and so I hope you'll all take what you will from it and respond accordingly. From the chat, it sounds like there's a lot of conversation around the economics of farms and access of consumers to farms and vice versa. I know some of you touched on it before, this idea of co-ops and subsidies and the whole gamut of the economy of agriculture. And so I'm just wondering, it sounds like there's a lot of people who have different ideas in terms of how to shift beyond. And as you all are intimately engaged with this work, maybe even just reiterating some of what you shared in the chat, that would be really helpful to just record on screen and to get it well said. So again, we'll go to Chuck first.
Yeah, I think something that I often think of is people talk about free markets, and that's a real pet peeve for me because markets are not free. They're not unfree either. They're just markets. They're things that we invented for how things get bought and sold. And when it comes to farming, we've created some really crappy markets that exploit people, that exploit the land, that produce empty calories, to people. It's like the markets are terrible. So I like to think of them as not being free, because when people talk about free markets, it's like, well, you can't do anything about it. It's just like the market, and it's not the market. Like, we made it, we created it as a society. So it's in our hands to change the market, if not overthrow the market, but at the very least, change it to do the things that we want it to do. And we want everybody to be able to eat real food. And we want everybody who works creating real food to be able to live a decent life. It seems like pretty straightforward. And we got to get our act together here to make this thing happen. I mean, ultimately, but so whenever you hear free markets, my ears always perk up like, what's this person actually saying? Like, come on, let's make markets that work.
Awesome, thank you, Chuck. Marita, gonna come to you next.
Well, what can I say? It's amazing to think about co-ops and all that. And what I was sharing on the chat box is like the co-ops I'm talking about are really not led by farmers themselves, like DFA is a big monster and really, really just deciding, how much do they buy, how much do they pay. That's the crisis, and at the end of the day, whoever is making profit from the farmers and farm workers' work are the Hannafords, the Walmarts, the Whole Foods, even the Trader Joe's, And Hannaford has this program that says, oh, we partner with local farmers to sell their products. Excellent, but are they paying really what they should be paying? And also understanding the dynamics of power in a farm where the farmer has access to many, many things, maybe, or a few things, but the farm workers don't. And that's when migrant justice comes into place. You know, we are raising the voices of this community of farm workers that as immigrants, as not having access to all these things, a lot of people come with a lot of knowledge of and the love of the land, but they don't have access to do the work that they want to do. And even though if they want to change the how they are milking the cows, and they don't have any power at the farm level to do that unless they organize. And sometimes we can change one thing in a farm and going farm by farm, but really doesn't create a whole change in the system. That's why we create the program. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, you know, we can talk about a lot of things for farmers, but until the farmers that have farm workers don't see them as human beings as well, until they don't see them as not only a labor force, even the, you know, really amazing farmers that talk about the program really good, they always worry about the labor force, not the person. And I think that's really important to take into account.
Thank you, Marita. Well said. We're going to go to Nico next.
Yeah, so one interesting comment maybe on what Marita just said is, last April there was a Cows, Land and Labor Conference at Dartmouth College, and there was a panel with Migrant Justice and a local dairy farmer, Gladstone, in the Connecticut River Valley, and the connection and conversation that started at that panel, which didn't ultimately go very well. There was a lot of is what has developed in the meantime is the understanding that farmers are also oppressed in this system of industrial agriculture, and as soon as farmers can see that, they see their interests more aligned with the labor that is working for them. So you have on one side the power equilibrium of employer-employee, and on the other side of two oppressed parties within a system. The dairy markets are so regulated that there's really no free enterprise there or decision-making, pricing power, or anything. So it's essentially like institutionalized serfdom of the farmers to the global dairy market. And so that's what makes the dairy situation so complex, but I'm sure Marita fully understands that already. I just wanted to sort of point out that often it's sort of like the farm owners versus the labor that gets exploited, but it's really an exploitative system, and it's designed not to be transparent, and it's designed not to be open and well understood by the public, because that makes it easier to manipulate and abuse. And so that's sort of the inherent structure of agriculture, industrialized agriculture in this country. And so remind me where we started on this.
It was a very broad question just of the economy of agriculture and how to improve it.
Yeah. It's a lot, you know, and here, so looping back to Chuck, what he said, free market, not free market, it's equal market access capability or ability that really counts. And that's where the picture is fundamentally skewed, in that the big corporations get the policies that going their way and they get the subsidies going their way. And that screws the whole market access issue. And there's a lot of inequality built into the markets already. I completely agree with that. And the markets aren't very efficient, they aren't well organized. And the middlemen take the cream off the top in so many ways. And so if we can at least acknowledge that we should all have a more equal access to it, I think that would be a big step forward. But boy, am I not holding my breath on that happening anytime soon. I mean, we can't even get it together when it comes to public utilities, and that's vastly more simple as a system than agriculture, you know. Anyways, I think that's, yeah. I mean, what we're seeing is, and I mean, the hope is that by having a disruption like COVID-19, and hopefully, and likely this will continue much, much longer than we think it is at this point. This disruption can be long enough and deep enough that it actually will force some change and strengthen the local systems and the decentralized systems and the distributed logistics and all the kind of things that make systems more resilient.
Thank you, Nico. Maddie, we'll ask the same question of you, and just a little refresher, the original question, which has modified a bit. So I want you to respond however you feel comfortable. The original question was originally from Henry Swayze, and what is the path to improving our soil, climate, and water the fastest, especially in terms of creating the kind of access to food systems for all people, and especially our marginalized populations?
Yes.
I think.
Here you go, Maddie.
Okay. Well, I think that, yeah, we touched on the kind of ecological piece of this earlier in terms of expanding access to marginalized populations. I think the economy piece is a big part of that. Nico had presented in the chat that if we were to redirect, subsidies for industrial agriculture toward regenerative farming and maybe toward being able to provide small-scale farm workers with living wages, that would go a long way. Like he is also more recently mentioning, I don't know how likely that is to actually happen, but I do think we should push for it. And I think that also in terms of increasing access for marginalized populations to this healthier food and to a regenerative food system, again, like a kind of more streamlined, centralized food hub, I think is pretty essential. I think, again, that cultivating foods that are native and culturally specific to populations outside of, the, I guess, like pretty white Protestant norm in Vermont is pretty essential. Like catering to migrant communities is really essential. And essentially, like, I think that tapping into some of the wealthier resources here in New England, because there is quite a concentration of wealth, in order to try to provide food for lower income people in the area, can also go a long way. So that can look like, I think I mentioned solidarity shares earlier, and so asking CSA members to contribute like a sliding scale fee on top of their regular CSA share, right? They could pay an extra 100 to 200 or more per season, and then that money can then be funneled into giving food to lower income clients. So I think that finding creative strategies within our communities to tap into wealth in terms, in order to be able to provide access to healthier foods can be helpful while we're waiting for the vast redistribution of industrial subsidies.
Thank you, Maddie. Thank you all so much for answering all those questions.